Breaking news from Westminster. A political shockwave has ripped through Downing Street, leaving the entire Labour government on unstable ground. What began as a simple property tax question quickly turned into one of the biggest credibility crises of Keir Starmer's leadership. Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, once considered one of the most powerful figures in Labour, suddenly found herself at the center of a financial controversy. A failure to pay approximately $40,000 in stamp duty tax on a property sale, a mistake that would prove politically fatal. At first, the story seemed small, a paperwork issue, the type of personal finance correction that politicians typically survive. But in the climate of modern British politics, where public trust is already at record lows and media scrutiny is unrelenting, this single issue became a magnet for national outrage. Opposition MPs began asking questions. Journalists dug into property documents, asking whether Rayner knew more than she admitted. And British voters, already frustrated by politics, felt the story reinforced something deeper. Politicians playing by different rules from ordinary people. Inside Parliament, the whispers began almost immediately. Did she know? Can she survive this? Will Starmer defend her? Or sacrifice her? By week 2, the scandal had moved from newspapers to the center of Prime Minister's questions. Starmer was grilled relentlessly, forced to defend his deputy in real time. To some, his defense looked strong, loyal, and unwavering. But to others, including nervous Labour MPs, it looked risky, stubborn and politically blind. Then came the turning point. Rayner formally resigned. Her resignation letter was emotional and defensive. She insisted she had not acted dishonestly, and that the media had exaggerated the situation, but she also stated that she could no longer allow the scandal to overshadow the government's mission. In one stroke, Keir Starmer lost not only his deputy, but also one of Labour's most experienced and influential political operators, and the reaction was immediate. The opposition pounced. Newspapers branded the moment as a collapse in Labour discipline. Tory MPs warned that if the Deputy Prime Minister could fall due to personal, financial issues, then no one in this government is safe. And inside Labour, the real panic wasn't about Rayner's resignation at all. It was about what it revealed, that the leadership was far less stable than it looked. Just days after her resignation, political analysts were already saying that the scandal had exposed deep fractures at the top of Labour. According to reporting from major outlets, senior Labour figures felt the Prime Minister's team had become isolated, defensive, and disconnected from the rest of the parliamentary party. Some MPs began quietly asking the question, if Starmer can't protect his own deputy, can he protect the government? The bigger issue wasn't the stamp duty or paperwork, it was the message. A government promising professionalism, integrity, and accountability now looked vulnerable on those very same points. And just like that, the Rayner drama transformed from a personal tax issue into something much bigger. A credibility test of Labour, a leadership test for Starmer, and a political opening for Labour's opponents. Over the next days, Starmer was forced into a rapid cabinet reshuffle, one that would send new personalities into top roles, while shaking the foundations of the government. That reshuffle set off new tensions, new power struggles, and new internal divisions. And it was only the beginning. This was not just a resignation. This was the spark that lit the political fire now spreading across Westminster. Stay with us, because in the next chapter, we look inside the cabinet reshuffle that followed, the new battles forming inside Labour's senior ranks, and the desperate attempt to save the government from sliding into full political meltdown. So after Angela Rayner's resignation, things inside Downing Street didn't calm down. They got hotter. And that's something many viewers don't realize. When a political scandal hits this level, the resignation is rarely the end of the story. It is more like the first domino falling, and the rest start crashing behind it. And for Keir Starmer, that next domino was the forced cabinet reshuffle. Suddenly, the Prime Minister was facing two urgent realities at the same time. First, he needed to show the public that the government was still functioning, still strong, still stable, still in control. Second, he needed to reassure his own party that authority was not slipping away. So Starmer did what every leader does in crisis. He moved pieces around the chessboard. Now here's where it gets interesting. To the public, a cabinet reshuffle is usually just seen as politicians changing seats, but in reality, it's much more like a war room operation. Every appointment sends a message. Every removal sends an even stronger one. And people inside the party read those moves like stock. Market signals, rising power, falling power, who is in, who is out, and who might be next. The reshuffle after Rayner's exit was particularly sensitive. Rayner wasn't just any minister. She wasn't a backbencher or a mid-level official. She was the deputy prime minister, the second most powerful political figure in the government. Replacing her wasn't just filling a job. It was sending a signal about the future direction of Labour leadership. So when Starmer announced new appointments, the political world paid very close attention. MPs were reading the list line by line, name by name, asking questions like, did Starmer promote loyalists? Did he reward critics to keep them quiet? Did he bring in fresh talent to calm public pressure? And more importantly, what does this reshuffle tell us about Starmer's state of mind? Because make no mistake, when a reshuffle happens under pressure, it reveals how confident or defensive a leader truly is. Inside Labour, the word that started circulating was bunker mentality, and that's not a phrase you want attached to a government. It suggests a leader closing themselves off, surrounded only by trusted advisors, not listening, not adapting, not consulting. According to reporting from multiple insiders, senior MPs felt that the Prime Minister's office had become isolated, cut off from the pulse of the parliamentary party. They complained that decisions were happening in a tight inner circle, and many felt they were learning about major moves from TV rather than from the party leadership directly. That creates resentment, and resentment creates pressure. And pressure creates something much more dangerous: disunity. Disunity is the silent poison of any government. It creates doubt in the public, doubt in the party, doubt in the media. And when a prime minister is already battling a scandal, the last thing they need is their own side whispering in the background. And trust me, after Rayner's resignation, there was whispering. Some Labour figures privately argued that Starmer should have forced her out earlier to protect the government. Others said the opposite, that defending her longer would have shown loyalty and conviction. Both sides disagreed not just on strategy, but on the Prime Minister himself. Was he decisive, indecisive, cold, calculated, or just overwhelmed? Now let's zoom out for a moment, because this is where the political psychology becomes fascinating. In politics, when a leader is strong, every mistake looks survivable. But when a leader is looking shaky, even small missteps look like signs of collapse. And at this moment in the story, the public mood was shifting. Labour MPs sensed it. The media sensed it. Even the opposition sensed it. Suddenly, things were being interpreted differently. A delayed statement looked like hesitation. A cautious response looked like fear. A reshuffle looked like damage control, not strategy. And it got worse. Because every government reshuffle creates winners and losers inside the party. Some ministers got promoted. Others were sidelined. And the ones who felt left out didn't stay quiet. They began briefing journalists off the record. Anonymous sources, speaking about Starmer's judgment, his decision-making, his temperament. This is how political crises deepen, not through dramatic shouting in Parliament, but through private doubt becoming public gossip. But here's the real turning point. The reshuffle didn't calm the government. It exposed how many people believed the scandal was just the surface of a deeper problem, that the Labour government was not united, that it was struggling under the weight of responsibility, and that Starmer's authority was starting to look less solid than before. And then something else happened. The public started asking new questions. Not about Rayner. About Starmer. Was he actually in full control? Or was he reacting rather than leading? Was Labour still the party of discipline and professionalism? Or was the shine starting to wear off? Political analysts describe this moment as the beginning of narrative shift. And narrative shifts are powerful. They don't happen loudly. They happen slowly. And then all at once. And that's when Labour got hit with the next wave of pressure, not from the Tories, but from somewhere much more unexpected. A rising political force outside the traditional two-party system, a party gaining traction, gaining votes, gaining attention, and threatening to change the entire political map of Britain. That is where we go next. Because in the next chapter, we explore how the rise of Reform UK turned Labour's internal crisis into something much bigger. A threat not just to Starmer's leadership, but to the entire balance of power in UK politics. The political ground beneath. Britain has shifted in a way that feels sudden and seismic to many observers. What looked not long ago like a predictable contest between Labour and the Conservatives has become a three-way scramble, with Reform UK charging into the centre of the story and taking support from both main parties. That surge has left Labour, despite holding power, with a legitimacy, problem that goes beyond normal, opposition rhetoric. It's a reality check about how quickly voters can change their minds when they feel unheard or betrayed. Reform's rise didn't happen overnight. Local election results and by-election shocks showed the party making breakthroughs in council seats and mayoralties, and in some areas winning control that had once been considered safe for traditional parties. Those gains translated into momentum. National polling models began to show reform approaching levels that once would have been unimaginable, and in certain projections they sit within striking distance of a parliamentary majority if an election were held now. That's not just an electoral story. It's a signal that long-standing political loyalties are fraying. What does this mean for labor? For one thing, it removes the comfort of being the obvious default for anti-conservative voters. Labor must now fight on two fronts: to defend its traditional base while also trying to win back voters drifting to reform. The problem is structural. Many of the voters attracted to reform aren't ideologically rigid. They're motivated by issues like immigration, cost of living, distrust of elites, and a sense their voices aren't heard. Labor's technocratic approach and promises of competence can look hollow when voters feel their day-to-day struggles aren't being addressed, and that perception has been amplified by scandals and missteps that make competence look more like a PR exercise than real change. Inside labor, the mood has turned introspective and urgent. Senior figures are asking the hard political questions. Have we misread the public mood? Have policy choices drifted away from the priorities of ordinary people? Are party messages landing or being drowned out by a more visceral, populist narrative? In private, MPs are realistic. A leader's record in government matters. But so does emotional resonance. Even the sharpest policy won't win back trust if voters feel the government is distant and unresponsive. That's the core challenge. Starmer now faces how to combine political competence with emotional credibility. The practical effects are already visible in the data. Several national polling models, including detailed MRP studies, have shown reform eating into labor and conservative vote shares, sometimes leaving labor with less than 20% support in certain snapshots. While polls always fluctuate, the trend line is worrying. The challenge isn't a single bad week. It's a sustained pattern of drift. For any governing party, sustained low approval creates a political environment where small mistakes become magnified, and where opponents can exploit doubts to reshape the narrative about competence and trust. So how does reform convert local wins into national threat? The mechanics are straightforward but potent. Local victories give them credibility, media attention, and a network on the ground to contest more seats. They turn protest votes into organized campaigning. They also force mainstream parties into constant defensive mode, reacting to headlines rather than setting the agenda. When a party can claim momentum, undecided voters start to consider it seriously. In a first-past-the-post system, that shift can have outsized consequences. A concentrated swing in key constituencies can translate into a dramatic change in seat numbers. Analysts have warned that if current trends continue, the traditional two-party dominance could be fundamentally altered in the next election cycle. Labor's response so far has been a mix of policy positioning and defensive messaging. Ministers point to delivery, programs rolled out, services protected, and long-term reform agendas. But critics argue that policy announcements alone won't change perception without a clear narrative that connects those policies to everyday life. The other danger is internal division. When MPs and ministers publicly or privately disagree about tone and strategy, the party's image of unity and competence is weakened. And unity is the currency of government, especially when you are trying to convince voters that your administration can be trusted over the long haul. We also have to consider the role of personalities. Nigel Farage and other reform figures have an ability to frame issues in plain, emotionally resonant language that cuts through technocratic detail. That matters, because politics is often more about storytelling than spreadsheets. If voters feel a party understands them, they'll listen. Labor's challenge is to translate its technical competence into a narrative that feels human, urgent, and relevant, and fast. The longer that translation takes, the more space reform and others have to occupy that narrative space. There's a strategic calculus class in Westminster now. Some moderate Labour MPs argue for an urgent reset, clearer messaging on cost of living, a visible emphasis on local concerns, and a reshuffle that demonstrates dynamism. Others caution that panicked, short-term moves risk appearing reactive and shallow. The Prime Minister's office must thread a narrow needle, act decisively to show leadership, while avoiding hasty policy, swings that undermine long-term credibility. It's a perilous balancing act. If Starmer gets it wrong, he could accelerate the drift. If he gets it right, he can slow or even reverse the momentum. Timing and tone are everything. The opposition is not idle. Conservatives see an opportunity to redefine themselves and claw back voters. But they are also squeezed by reform's rise. In many seats, the anti-labor vote has fragmented, creating openings and uncertainty. The electoral arithmetic becomes unpredictable. A unified anti-labor front is no longer guaranteed. And seat-level battles will depend heavily on local dynamics, campaign ground games, and candidate appeal. That uncertainty makes short-term forecasting risky, but it also creates enormous opportunity for parties that can organize and mobilize effectively. What should voters watch for in the coming months? First, by-election results and local council contests. They remain the clearest, real-time indicators of whether reform's surge is consolidating or just a protest wave. Second, detailed MRP polling models and voter intention snapshots. If reform maintains a consistent high share across multiple polls, the political landscape has genuinely shifted. Third, internal party movements, reshuffles, resignations, or clear signs of backbench restlessness inside Labor would be a red flag. Fourth, messaging, whether Labor can craft and sell a narrative that connects policy to everyday life. All of these signals will determine whether the surge is a temporary shock or a long-term realignment. Let's be clear. A surge doesn't automatically translate to government for reform. Institutional factors, strategic voting patterns, and the geographical distribution of support all matter. The UK electoral system rewards concentrated, regional support more than broad, but thin national backing. Yet the speed of political change means nothing can be taken for granted. The political map is volatile. A party that once seemed fringe can become central if it mixes credible local organization with a narrative that resonates. That is the tension every major party is now feeling. Finally, this moment is a test of political adaptability. Parties that can pivot, not just in rhetoric, but in concrete policy choices that alleviate daily pressures for voters, will survive and possibly thrive. Those that cling to old assumptions about voter loyalty will likely face erosion. For Labor, the challenge is existential in tone. Hold the center by demonstrating both competence and connection, or risk watching support bleed, away to a rising force that promises something different, even if that promise is risky or controversial. That's the story we'll be watching closely. Because if even one large part of the electorate decides to try a new direction, the consequences will be profound. And before we end this segment, make sure you subscribe to EchoStorm for further videos, for deep analysis, breaking updates, and on-the-ground context you won't get in a 10-second headline. Stay tuned, stay informed, and we'll bring you the next chapter as it unfolds. Inside Parliament, the atmosphere had shifted, from political debate to something more electric, almost like a trial. Being held in the court of public perception, MPs were no longer simply exchanging policy arguments. They were publicly positioning themselves for what many believed could be a coming change in leadership. Every speech, every jab, every reaction was being watched not just by the UK, but by international media as well. The world's cameras were rolling, and political careers were on the line. The Prime Minister's opponents had picked up on a narrative, and they were holding onto it with both hands. They argued that the government's response to the BBC Leadsome crisis was not just slow, but symbolic of a wider weakness. To them, this was the moment the public finally saw cracks in the foundations of the leadership that had once promised stability, professionalism, and control. The more the government defended itself, the more the opposition insisted this was proof of panic. A notable moment came when senior MPs began openly questioning whether the Prime Minister's government still reflected the values it claimed to represent. Some accused Downing Street of allowing the political environment to become toxic, while others went further, suggesting that if leadership could not enforce standards within one of the nation's most important institutions, the BBC, then how could it hope to lead the country through broader challenges? The Prime Minister's team, meanwhile, was fully aware of how dangerous the situation had become. Advisors were said to be meeting late into the night, working on strategy, communications, and internal management. The challenge was complicated. The story was no longer about one interview or one news organization. It had evolved into a symbol of something bigger, doubts about leadership itself. Once a political narrative reaches that stage, reversing it becomes incredibly difficult. Inside the chamber, ministers tried to push back. They reminded MPs of the government's legislative record, policy successes, and ongoing reforms. They argued that the scandal was being exaggerated for political gain and that the BBC should not be used as a weapon to destabilize the government. But the more they spoke, the more it appeared that Parliament was not in the mood to be reassured. Members continued to interrupt, laugh, and challenge, creating an environment that felt less like structured political exchange and more like rising political theater. Outside Westminster, commentators were pouring fuel onto the fire. Talk shows, podcasts, late-night panels, and social media streams were buzzing with endless questions. Was the Prime Minister losing control? Was this a temporary crisis or the beginning of a much deeper shift in British politics? Some analysts even compared the moment to past political collapses in UK history, moments where a seemingly small issue became the catalyst for governments falling apart. Whether this situation would reach that scale was still uncertain, but the pressure was undeniably mounting. Voters, too, had begun responding. Polls showed that trust in political leadership was fluctuating rapidly, and public opinion was splitting down the middle. Some defended the Prime Minister, saying attacks were opportunistic and destabilizing. Others argued that accountability must come first, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. But one thing was common across communities. People were watching closely. They could sense that something unusual was unfolding, something that could influence not just the next news cycle, but possibly the country's political direction. Within the ruling party, the reaction was especially tense. MPs who typically stayed silent were suddenly speaking in hushed tones, behind closed doors, calculating risk, measuring careers, and quietly preparing for all possible outcomes. Leadership in politics is not just about governance, it is about confidence. And once colleagues start to doubt that leadership can survive, events often speed up in unpredictable ways. Some MPs were still loyal, some were uncertain, and some were preparing for scenarios no one would have predicted 6 months ago. Meanwhile, parliamentary voices kept returning to the same question. What happens next? Would there be an internal reshuffle? Would there be a formal investigation? Would the BBC fallout lead to deeper scrutiny of other institutions? Or would the Prime Minister attempt to take bold action to shut down the narrative once and for all? No one at this stage could say for sure. But the momentum had clearly changed. The issue was no longer whether the government could avoid criticism. Now it was whether it could survive the political wave forming around it. For now, Parliament continued its debate with the world listening. Every clap, every laugh, every demand for answers was amplified in a way few parliamentary sessions ever are, and as the tension built, the nation understood this was not just another day in politics. This was one of those rare moments where the direction of leadership itself was being publicly tested in real time. What would happen next was not yet known, but everyone watching could feel that the stakes had risen dramatically. Please subscribe to Echo Storm for further videos. The tension in Westminster has reached a point where even routine parliamentary sessions feel like pressure cookers. The atmosphere is dense, charged with political uncertainty, and every statement from the Prime Minister or opposition leaders is dissected not just for meaning but for weakness. And at the center of this intensifying storm is a single, unavoidable question. Can Keir Starmer hold the confidence of the country when even his own benches are beginning to look unsure? It's not that Labour MPs have suddenly turned against him. Far from it. The majority still want stability, especially after the chaos of recent years. But underneath the surface, you can sense the unease. Backbenchers whisper about the polls. Veteran MPs talk about the importance of decisive communication. And new MPs, the ones who rode into Parliament on a wave of hope and expectation, are facing their first taste of political reality. Public support can disappear as quickly as it arrives. For Starmer, this is an incredibly delicate moment. He has to manage the government, respond to internal pressure, fight off external criticism, and appear strong enough to lead. But at the same time, he can't afford to ignore the voters who are slipping away toward other parties. That's why his recent speeches and PMQ's performances have taken on a sharper edge. He's more defensive, more combative, and more determined to remind voters of the government's accomplishments, even when those accomplishments are overshadowed by wider economic frustrations. The problem is, voters are not responding to technical achievements right now. They're responding to emotion, frustration, and the feeling that the country is stuck. And whenever a government struggles to shift the national mood, Any rival political movement, even one that was once considered fringe, can begin to look like a viable alternative. That's exactly what is happening with Reform UK. But the pressure isn't coming from Reform alone. The Conservatives, despite their fragmentation, have found new energy in attacking the government's credibility. Their strategy is simple: highlight every Labour weakness, amplify every internal disagreement, and present themselves as the realistic alternative for voters tired of uncertainty. Even though they face their own internal divisions, they know that public perception can change rapidly if a few major news cycles swing in their favor. In this environment, every misstep from Labour is amplified. When a minister misspeaks, it becomes a headline. When a policy rollout is delayed, social media erupts. When Starmer appears hesitant or overly cautious, critics jump to claim that he lacks authority. This is the price of power, but it's also the weakness that both Conservatives and Reform are eager to exploit. Inside number 10, advisors are increasingly aware of how quickly narratives are shifting. They're pushing for clearer messaging, bolder announcements, and more visible engagement with the public. That's why you're seeing more visits, more on-camera interactions, and more attempts to reframe the government's achievements. But the truth is simple. Unless voters feel the impact in their daily lives, messaging alone won't save approval ratings. Meanwhile, there's a growing cultural divide shaping this entire conflict. Reform UK appeals to voters who feel disconnected from traditional political elites. The Conservatives appeal to voters who want stability but also tougher action on issues like immigration and security. Labour appeals to voters who want competence and social progress. And somewhere between these narratives, millions of ordinary citizens are deciding whether any of these parties truly represent their concerns. This is why the next few months are so crucial. Every by-election, every debate, every news cycle will contribute to the political momentum that shapes the year ahead. And Labour knows that if they cannot rebuild emotional trust, not just political support, they risk losing the narrative entirely. But one of the most overlooked dynamics is happening behind the scenes. Labour MPs in marginal constituencies are deeply worried. They know that even small shifts in voter sentiment could cost them their seats. Many of them are already quietly pushing for more radical messaging, more visible leadership, and more aggressive responses to Reform's rise. They're asking the leadership to stop playing defense and start taking the fight directly to their opponents. Some inside Westminster believe Labour's hesitation stems from a fear of controversy. Starmer has built his image around discipline, moderation, and stability, traits that appealed strongly during the turbulent previous government. But now that caution may be working against him. In a political environment driven by strong personalities and bold statements, calm leadership can sometimes look like stagnation. At the same time, Labour insiders know that lurching toward reactionary politics could alienate core supporters. They're caught between two powerful pressures: the need to win back disillusioned voters and the need to remain consistent with their party's values. It's a balancing act with no easy answer. Looking at the polling trends, one thing becomes clear. The public doesn't want more political drama. They want direction. And right now, no party is fully convincing voters that they can deliver it. That vacuum is what's fueling the instability we're seeing. When the political center feels uncertain, the edges gain power. When leadership feels fragile, alternatives look stronger. That's why Reform supporters feel energized, why Conservative strategists sense an opportunity, and why Labour is under intense pressure to recalibrate quickly. This is a turning point in British politics. If Labour cannot stabilize its position, the next election could reshape the country's political landscape more dramatically than anyone predicted just a year ago. The stakes are enormous, not just for the parties involved, but for the future direction of the nation. And what happens next could come down to a single question. Can Keir Starmer reclaim the confidence of the country before momentum shifts beyond recovery? Before we continue into the final part, make sure you subscribe to Echo Storm for more deep dives, sharp political analysis, and real-time updates from the heart of Westminster. As the political storm intensifies, the atmosphere inside Westminster feels heavier than ever. People are quieter in the corridors. Conversations break off when someone walks by, and even seasoned MPs can sense that something is shifting beneath the surface. It's the kind of moment in politics when everyone feels change approaching, but no one can predict exactly how, or how quickly, it will unfold. For Keir Starmer and his top advisors, the pressure has become relentless. Every morning begins with new polling, new newspaper headlines, new broadcasts questioning his grip on power. Every evening ends with meetings that stretch long into the night. as they try to understand why public confidence is slipping and how to stop the tide. It's not one issue causing the problem. It's the accumulation of everything. The BBC scandal, the Commons uproar, Reform UK's rise, the shift in public mood, the economic frustrations, all merging into one intense wave of political instability. Inside Downing Street, conversations that would have been unthinkable just months ago are quietly being held. Advisors are openly debating how to reset the government's messaging, how to re-energize the public, how to show strength when critics are claiming weakness. But even the strongest messaging cannot erase the growing perception that leadership is wobbling. And politics, especially at this level, is not just about policies, it's about perception. The opposition senses it too. Conservatives see an opportunity, even while managing their own internal fractures. Reform UK sees momentum building and is using it with precision. And independent commentators have started saying what many inside Parliament have whispered for weeks. The Prime Minister is entering one of the most dangerous phases of his leadership. In the Commons, Starmer tries to project confidence, but the reactions he faces are growing harsher. MPs interrupt more aggressively. Backbenchers shout louder. Even those who remain loyal look uneasy. Every exchange feels like a test, not just of policies, but of leadership itself. And each time Starmer tries to answer, the chamber reacts with the kind of energy that suggests his critics smell vulnerability. But what's happening behind the scenes may be even more significant. Senior Labour MPs, the ones who usually keep internal disagreements private, have begun raising serious concerns. Some warn that unless the government shows stronger direction immediately, Reform UK will continue carving into Labour's working-class base. Others argue that Labour must stop playing defensively and confront the Conservatives and reform head-on with sharper, bolder messaging. A few quietly worry that if things continue this way, there could be internal pressure for major changes long before the next election arrives. At the same time, a second fear is spreading that the deterioration in public confidence might soon affect international markets, diplomatic partners, and global perceptions of UK political stability. Allies abroad are watching too, asking whether the UK is entering another period of uncertainty. Every shift in British politics has global implications. And right now, the world is watching closely. Meanwhile, the public mood is becoming increasingly restless. Voters are tired of crisis after crisis. They want clarity, direction, and stability. But instead they're seeing political clashes, dramatic headlines, and a sense that the government is struggling to regain control. That emotional disconnect is dangerous, far more dangerous than any single scandal. When people stop feeling led, they start looking elsewhere for leadership. This is why the next few weeks could become a turning point. Party strategists are preparing for every possible scenario. An internal reshuffle, a major policy reset, a national address to the country, or even potential challenges from within the party if the situation worsens. Nothing is certain, but everything is now possible. As Starmer faces growing media pressure, new interview questions, and increasingly hostile parliamentary sessions, he must find a way to strike back. Not cautiously, but decisively. If he hesitates, the narrative will harden around him. If he appears too defensive, critics will claim he is losing grip. And if he fails to recapture the emotional trust of voters, the upcoming election could become one of the most unpredictable political contests in recent memory. But this moment is not just about Starmer. It's about the entire direction of the country. Will Britain move toward a more centrist future, a more populist wave, or a fractured landscape with multiple rising movements? Will Labour regain its momentum? Or will parties like Reform UK continue reshaping political boundaries? And will the public believe that the current leadership can steer the nation toward stability? Or will they demand something entirely different? The truth is, the next chapter of British politics is being written right now, in Parliament, on the streets, in polling numbers, and in the conversations happening quietly behind closed doors. The stakes have never been higher for Starmer, and as the pressure builds, the question becomes unavoidable. Can he survive this political storm? Or is the United Kingdom preparing for a shift in leadership that could redefine its future? Whichever way the story unfolds, one thing is certain: this is not the end of the crisis. This is the beginning of the next chapter. Before you go, make sure you subscribe to Echo Storm for more sharp analysis, breaking political updates, and deep dives into the stories shaping the UK's future.